What if the real horror isn't the monster under the bed, but the people who claim they're here to help? Today, I'm joined by author and artist Chris Panatier to talk about his gripping novel, The Redemption of Morgan Bright, a psychological horror story that takes you deep into the shadow of institutional control, forced conformity, and the terrifying erosion of identity. So without further ado, I give you Chris Panatier. Chris, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you for having me on, Vincent.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining me on this 18th day of April 2025. It was a pleasure meeting you in person at the Ghoulish Book Festival, and it was an absolute blast to check out your superb work of psychological horror, The Redemption of Morgan Bright. Psychological horror is definitely my favorite subgenre, and The Redemption of Morgan Bright had everything from the isolation of a psychiatric hospital to the terror of mind control, all layered with the dread of grief and guilt. So thank you for joining me on the show today to discuss this amazing work.
Well, thanks so much. I'm glad this one hit your sweet spot.
Absolutely, yes. Well, so a little synopsis of the book, and listeners at home, you're all aware of my incredibly long-winded first question. So, Chris, I promise it won't be a trend.
I've listened. It's all good.
Okay.
It's all good.
Well, so the book is about a woman named Morgan Bright who checks herself in under a false identity to uncover what happened to her sister, who was once hospitalized at the psychiatric facility known as Hollyhock House. Her sister was later found barefoot and wearing nothing but a hospital gown in the freezing cold, and she died shortly after being discovered. So this hospital, formerly known as the Nebraska State Lunatic Asylum, had a long history of patient abuse and scandal, which eventually led to its closure. It was later reopened under private ownership, however. So Morgan checks herself in, and needless to say, the hospital's intake methods are anything but standard from the start. So the diagnosis that Morgan is admitted under is actually based on an old law that allowed husbands to have their wives committed. It's referred to in the book as domestic psychosis. So, can you tell us a little bit about the law and its history?
Sure, yeah. It was mostly state laws back in the early 1800s to mid 1800s, and you really didn't see them much after about 1851. But there were laws that allowed husbands to have their wives committed under very vague sort of symptoms, very vague diagnoses. And so it didn't have to be any one diagnosis. And for me, I did in my research in discovering that there were lots of different reasons why someone might have their wife committed. And a lot of times it was just they wanted a new wife. This was the easiest way to get a new wife. I took all of those different diagnoses, which most of them were pretty lacking in scientific psychological basis back then. And I created one heading that I put them all under, and that was domestic psychosis. So domestic psychosis is my invention, but it's sort of a umbrella for hysteria and all the other, sort of labels that women received all the way up until this century.
So you say that a lot of them were used when the husband was actually just trying to get a new wife. So would that entail them being involuntarily confined, and
Yeah.
would they end up just committed there for the rest of their lives, or?
Well, that did happen.
Wow.
That did happen. And, a lot of times men were just seeking grounds to have a marriage dissolved. Or in some cases, I think that both the men and the doctors who were doing this were convinced that their wives had psychological issues. And that's not to say that all people don't suffer from some psychological issues. I'm sure some of these were warranted, and they warranted treatment that was correct for the diagnosis. But a lot of times women were just sort of shuttered away. And even if it wasn't a permanent thing, it was enough to dissolve the marriage in many cases. So I think it's important to point out that it isn't as simple as, oh, I just want a new wife. I think that situations are much more complex than that on the whole. That's sort of a shorthand, but a lot of cases were made where, for whatever reason, disagreement in the marriage, it was easier to do this rather than get a marriage annulled or whatever. Men were able to just have their wives committed, and on very, very thin evidence as well.
Gotcha. Well, when Morgan is first admitted, there's a reference to a sort of, at least the way I interpret it, is kind of a trauma-based mind control, without giving away any spoilers. So I'm not a tinfoil hat wearing guy, but you might mistake me for one, because I do enjoy going down the conspiracy rabbit holes for entertainment. One of the factual cases that fascinates me is Project MKUltra, which the CIA admitted and even apologized for. But on the other hand, there's the infamous Project Monarch that people like to throw around, and it was never verified as a real operation, but supposedly it used trauma to embed commands that could later be carried out by alternate identities that were formed through dissociation caused by the severe trauma. So, did you use any of these real or legendary operations as inspiration for any aspects of the story?
So I appreciated you referencing those. I didn't use any specific attempt on mind control or forced conformatory activity or anything like that. But what I did do was I used the general heading that would all fall under. And one of the techniques for enforcing conformity and creating conformity in the first place, and that is a psychological process called identity stripping. And that phrase actually comes up in the book, but it's used by people who are confining other people. It's used in prisons. It's used in governments. It's used for armies. And it's a way to literally, you try to strip away the individual and turn them into something that is much more malleable and easily controlled. And so there's lots of ways to do that. There are, ways via torture. There are ways via sexual abuse, via verbal abuse, physical abuse. There are a lot of ways to go about identity stripping. And so the entry into Hollyhock does have what would be called an identity stripping ceremony.
Yeah, and they even make reference to Stockholm syndrome. And I was wondering, have you ever heard of Chase Hughes?
I haven't. Mm-mm.
You should look him up. He's got a YouTube channel. He teaches, I think, mostly private organizations, but he teaches marketing techniques, and they're all based on hypnosis. Yeah, he really kind of, it's very interesting, the stuff that people use in marketing. It's basically black magic.
Yeah. I've vaguely heard of some of that, so I'll have to check that out. Chase Hughes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, so circling back to the book, a large part of this book is in the form of epistolary fiction, in the form of police interview transcripts and text message logs. So what do you think made it so much more compelling than just standard dialogue?
Well, that's a great question. When I had written about 100 pages of this, because I'm a bit of a pantser, I was telling the story of Morgan going into the asylum, and I had gotten about 100 pages in, and I was like, I need to be telling the story simultaneously on the outside as well, and create really two threads that eventually are going to intersect. Part of it was that the prose chapters in this book, there's a lot going on. And I personally, as a reader, I like it when I can have digestible sections of reading, whether it's a chapter or whatever, that kind of keep things going, that I don't get lost in too much. And so my own attention span is sort of my barometer for whether what I'm writing needs to be cut up. And what's going on inside the tale that Morgan's alter ego is telling while she's inside, there's a lot going on. It's very dense. And it's also, I was evoking sort of a almost Victorian, but sort of that mid-Atlantic accent from the 1940s and 50s.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about? Which was very strange. Like all the movie stars had it, in that era.
Yeah.
So I was trying to evoke an era. I was kind of mixing eras, and I really enjoyed doing that for that part of the book. But also I wanted to give readers a little bit of a break. And at the same time, I wanted to be telling this concurrent story on the outside. So I thought a really good way to do that would be to have this witness that identifies as Charlotte Turner, which is the alter ego. And this is all occurring after these events have unfolded at Hollyhock. And I thought that the transcript was a very kind of engaging, quick way to get the information out and tell the story I wanted to tell. And it's exactly as you would hear it. If this happened and you found this witness, they would tell you the story. And then just from a craft perspective, I wanted to have two people having a conversation, or in some cases in this, a third shows up. And for the reader to be able to visualize the scene without any blocking, right? Without any, she turned to him or they stood up or whatever. There's none of that. All of the physical interaction, all of the physicality of the scene is suggested by their language. So, there's a point where the investigator, offers his jacket to the witness, and the witness takes it and, says, thank you. But there's nothing that says he offered the jacket. It's just him offering the jacket, her taking it, and you get this vision, this picture in your head of the actual action of the scene. And so I thought it was, from a craft perspective, a challenge, but also a lot of fun to not get too verbose with it, what they were saying, but still suggest the action of the scene. So those scenes, those transcript scenes they're almost like an interlude between the sort of big, heavy sections of Charlotte and then Morgan being in Hollyhock.
Yeah, you got my curiosity piqued. The old-timey or classic movie accent often heard in 1930s and 1940s films is known as I think it's what you said, transatlantic accent?
I said mid-Atlantic,
but yeah,
transatlantic.
It says sometimes also called the mid-Atlantic.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A consciously cultivated blend of American and British English, particularly the British received pronunciation.
It's sort of like, I remember that Madonna did it in like the 80s and 90s, and she created this sort of affect in the way she would speak. I didn't know it then, but it was this kind of very mid-Atlantic enunciation. Johnny Depp does it too, but his is way different. His is, I don't know what his is, but he's created an accent for himself as well.
I think he's gone so deep in so many different characters, he's lost his identity.
Yeah, he might have.
Let's see here. Well, so I'm assuming the hospital in the story is based on the actual Nebraska State Hospital, which is now known as the Lincoln Regional Center. Is that correct? And if so, have you ever been to the actual location or taken a tour?
Okay, so no, the Hollyhock is entirely made up.
No shit.
It's entirely made up. I didn't research any asylums in Nebraska whatsoever. I created it out of whole cloth. But here's why. When I was setting it up and I was coming up with the setting, I was like, most asylum stories, most mental institution stories, they either take place in a city, on the edge of a city, or in a forest somewhere. And so I wanted to explicitly push back on that and set it as far from that setting as I could. So I put it in the middle of a prairie in the middle of nowhere. And that's kind of how everything built out from there. And in fact, I think in the first few pages, as Morgan, aka Charlotte, and her accomplice are pulling up to the asylum, I make a point of saying there's no trees anywhere, and I wanted it to be this very desolate setting in the middle of nowhere that was hidden from scrutiny and all of that. So, and I was born and lived on the Great Plains until I was like 16. And so I have sort of you could call it an affection for it, but a respect for it as far as just how giant it is and how desolate it can be and how beautiful it can be. And there's a lot of beauty in this story, but with a shadowy edge to it. So that's what I wanted to set up with this hospital. And then I completely made up the entire thing about Nebraska State Asylum. I made up the newspaper articles that, are in the book, but I went and I read articles where people were writing about escaped mental patients during that era and tried to capture that voice. So hopefully it felt fairly authentic, but no, it was created from whole cloth. And I've been to Nebraska once, and it was to watch Texas play Nebraska in football.
Okay. Gotcha. Yeah, that's interesting. Well, man, I was hoping you
Sorry.
I was hoping you had been there and seen ghosts and all kinds of no, just playing.
The only ghosts I saw were in my bedroom each night I was writing this thing because I scared the crap out of myself. I'm a total scaredy cat.
Really?
Oh yeah. I am such a chicken. I've always loved horror, always, but my intake of horror was not a lot until just a few years ago, to be totally honest. And it was mainly because I was too scared to consume it. Oh. And so I have a total love affair with the horror of the 80s and 90s, but my intake was highly limited, one by my parents who wouldn't let me watch it, and
Same.
two by my own, and two by my own just chicken shittery, where I just was too scared. Now, in the past couple of years, I started watching things on my TV during the day. And then I made the mistake of watching Lake Mungo at night. And that movie scared the ever living shit out of me, but it's amazing. So if you haven't seen Lake Mungo, you gotta watch that. Yeah, that one goes very hard. The Australians go hard in their horror.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll definitely have to check that one out.
Check that one out for sure.
Well, let's see here. Probably the most enigmatic character of the book is the director of the hospital, Dr. Althea. Is it Edvane?
I pronounced it Edvane, but it's
okay.
Yeah, I sourced a lot of these names from I wanted Victorian names, and this is one that I found. And actually, Edvane was a first name that I found, and I just made it a last name for the book. But I think it was Edvane, but no one knows. We're not alive in the Victorian era, so nobody knows.
Gotcha. Well, Dr. Althea Edvane is introduced with a highly stylized and symbolic appearance, almost theatrical in her presentation. So what inspired, and I mean, I guess from what you were talking about, possibly the Victorian era, but specifically what inspired this visual aesthetic and what were you trying to convey about her character in that first encounter?
Well, so there's an intersection in this book of Victorian sensibilities, 1950s era sensibilities, and modern day wellness culture. And Edvane represents that intersection. So the way that women are treated at Hollyhock is a very, archaic manner of treating people. It does harken back to the Victorian era into the 1950s with electroshock therapy and all the different things that I address in the book. But Edvane is there to dress it up under the veil of wellness and to, proselytize its enlightened approach now, when really it's just a whitewashing of what they're really doing there. And so Edvane, I wanted her to be very put together, very handsome, very, fit, and look like basically a wellness influencer who happens to be the director of this hospital. And yeah, the wellness aspect of it is a veneer, which frankly, I think, wellness culture has become a veneer in our world already. I think it does a lot of damage. And so I was playing with those two things where, in the Victorian era and then towards the middle of the last century, the way that mental patients were treated was just how they were treated. And there wasn't much of an effort to really candy coat it. They were just sold, hey, this is what we do. This is how it works. Nowadays, people have a consciousness of what happened in the past. And so if you're going to try to do those things again, it needs to come under a disguise. And Etta Vane is there to provide that disguise.
Gotcha. Yeah, as scary as it might sound, it's called electroconvulsive therapy these days, but it's still utilized as a last resort.
Well, and there's a long conversation to be held there, which is that it actually, in some instances, is very helpful. And there's a bunch of images of it. A lot of people benefit from it, but it has to be highly controlled and done in the correct circumstances, not just as nothing's working, let's throw this at the wall. And of course, that the way I point out in the book that Morgan recognizes that what is happening at Hollyhock is not the sort of well-regulated, accepted way for it to be employed in contemporary society when done correctly, because people do benefit from it when it's used correctly. But we're talking more the, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest style in this book. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, continuing on with Dr. Etta Vane, she had a large wood-framed enclosure in her office that contained butterflies called hair streaks. So can you tell us a little bit about this group of butterflies and their significance to you for this story?
Well, first of all, I wanted the reader to realize that Etta Vane is cracked, okay? When
you said butterflies, I immediately thought of Buffalo Bill. I was like, what's happening here?
Yeah, so Etta Vane is not right. And she is obsessed about these butterflies. And I picked hair streaks because they are native to the area where the story takes place. So you will find hair streaks in northwestern Nebraska. And there's a bunch of different kinds, and she's very obsessed with these particular butterflies. She raises them, and then she, like any good villain, she waxes poetic about them. And you start to realize that there's a big link for her between these hair streaks and the women under her treatment at this asylum. And then again, those two things intersect later in the book, where there's some stuff that happens with those hair streaks, and you see a little bit more of Etta Vane's, you could call it spirituality, coming to light, and what she believes, and how she applies these and uses these butterflies to continue to break down these women.
Well, so there was a character in the story named Honora who was housed in the asylum after killing her baby in the throes of postpartum psychosis. So it reminded me of Andrea Yates, who, also suffering from postpartum psychosis, drowned her 5 children. Was she in any way an inspiration for this character?
No, not directly. I'm aware of that case, and that's extremely tragic, but I was using Honora to sort of stand in place of what is a very widespread occurrence for women who have postpartum. It can be called, postpartum depression or psychosis. It's got lots of different names, but, it's very common. And, I have friends who have dealt with it, and it's very common. It's very serious. And I wanted to have a character that had gone through that and represent the experience, at least in part, of some of those women and to, establish that this is not something that happens because these people are evil or anything like that, but it's a real, genuine psychological concern that, if it occurs, you would hope it would be addressed and that people would receive the treatment they would need. But unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. And Honora represents when someone is untreated and it goes all the way bad. But there is an ongoing dialogue between Honora and Morgan and Charlotte, frankly, throughout this whole book, sort of about Honora's experience. And the title of the book, Redemption of Morgan Bright, may extend to Honora as well.
Well, there are a lot of things that happen in the story where it's unclear whether or not they're psychological or supernatural. Do you enjoy leaving some aspects open to interpretation, or do you have a definitive answer in your own mind about whether certain events are real or imagined?
So there are definitely aspects of the story where you might wonder if it's supernatural or psychological. But I generally, as a writer, I have an answer in my head and I don't leave a lot. I may leave something ambiguous purposefully if it serves the story, but generally the idea of, is it mental illness or trauma or is it ghosts? Well, in this case, there is a definitive supernatural power at effect in Hollyhock. And while there's plenty of psychological things going on, there is a supernatural hand at play here.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Well, you mentioned just as of late starting to consume horror. What is it about psychological instability that makes it such fertile ground for horror? Is the mind more terrifying than any monster objectively, and especially for you?
Oh, I think it's all about losing control. I think the very root of psychological horror is we, as readers or watchers of psychological horror, we consume something from a safe place. We consume and experience the ultimate horror, which is losing your mind, from a safe place. I would much rather be in my right mind and, shredded to pieces by a werewolf than slowly lose my mind to dementia or Alzheimer's. And I say that with all sincerity. So that to me is why I think people are drawn to psychological horror in the form of fiction, because it's a chance to consume that horror, the ultimate horror, from a safe place. That's my answer for it. I may be wrong, but that's where I'm coming from on it.
Yeah, perfectly exemplified in the Redemption of Morgan Bright. It seems like if you can write good enough to immerse the reader to where they feel like they're in this psychologically, I guess what would it be, labil state. Whereas like if you were writing a book about, like you said, a werewolf, you can't quite immerse them in the horror of being chased by a werewolf because there's obviously no werewolf in the room. Maybe the sound outside can freak them out a little bit and make them like, oh my God, what is that? But like if you can lose them psychologically, you've basically put them in the same horror that the story is about.
Yeah, that's a great point. I do try to tie together and give answers for all of the important threads, but there are plenty of parts of this story where hopefully the reader is going, am I understanding this correctly? Am I appreciating this for what it is? Or am I missing something? And there are definitely some passages and there are some sections where I'm not telling the reader exactly what's going on. I want to leave the reader with a sense of imminent doom or a sense of disquiet. And so that is where I think that a little ambiguity or vagary really helps to increase an unsettling sense that then feeds into horror when you really deliver it on the page.
Yeah. Well, as we move back and forth between the narrative and the epistolary chapters of the book, we get a better sense of who the Detective Abram Gastrell is and how he operates. And he feels like he stepped right out of a hard-boiled detective novel. So was he inspired by a sort of pulp noir aesthetic?
Only a little bit. He speaks in this sort of very formal way, which I wanted again to capture sort of what people think it sounded like in the 1950s, right? What I'm portraying here is I'm portraying a society, and I don't give a date as to when this happens, but if you do the math on it, this is a contemporary story or a future story. It is not a past story. So I was kind of doing hey, the past is repeating itself type of thing. And so with his speech and mannerisms, I was trying to capture a little bit of that, and he should come across, I hope, as sort of the do-gooder detective who really all he's interested in is the truth. And he's a little bit behind the times as far as his regard for people in mental care, right? And he and the doctor, Hida Bentham, who is sort of supervising this interrogation, they have several exchanges where there's clearly a tension between them, where she's going, hey, like, here's how we approach and deal with problems of mental illness in modern society. And Gastrell is just like, I'm trying to figure out what, who got murdered and how many murders there were and what the fuck happened out there.
Uh-huh.
And I don't really care about your sort of niceties regarding these patients, even though he cares about the patients, but he's not one to get too woke, right, for himself. And Hida is there to be like, hey, we can do both of these things, but you need to be a little bit more conscious about how you're speaking about these people and how you're treating them.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point about him kind of being a do-gooder. If I remember correctly, he doesn't even smoke. So I suppose if he was the true hard-boiled noir aesthetic, he would smoke and at least have a drinking problem.
Yeah, for sure. I didn't put any drinking problem on the page. We'll leave that one ambiguous. But that was another thing about, the timing of this is I wanted everything to ring true for a near future society. So hopefully you're going to continue to see a decline in smoking. So when Morgan asked for a cigarette, he's like, Jesus, I don't know who still smokes here. Maybe one of the beat cops does, and we can get you some cigarettes from them. So that's kind of what I was doing there.
Gotcha. Well, in addition to the epistolary form of police interview transcripts, the reader also is exposed to the dynamic between Morgan and her sister Hadley through records of their text messages. The text exchanges between Morgan and Hadley feel immediate and intimate. What do you think this format allows you to express that traditional narration might not?
Well, that's a great question. This, hopefully, if it's done right, a text conversation between two sisters should be very intimate. There should be a lot unsaid, a lot assumed, and sort of a shorthand between them. If it had been a true text message conversation, there probably would have been fewer periods and fewer capitalizations, but I didn't want to trip up the reader with, dealing with all our usual text message sort of decorum. So it's a little bit more formal as far as, grammar, but for the most part, I wanted to capture two sisters who are very different and how they speak to each other just in a text string. And I try to be very observant of people who are not me and don't occupy my demographic. And so I pay a lot of attention to whenever I see depictions of women or sisters texting or seeing how my own sister texts me, even though I'm not her sister. I put a lot of that into the memory banks and then regurgitated it here to try to get the temperament of it and the pace of it and the just sort of rhythm of those text messages right. And then I had a number of beta readers, many of whom were younger women, younger than me, read it. And for the most part, they were really happy with those text exchange and said, yeah, this rings true, which is one of the things that I really wanted to verify. Is there anything I need to change about how these sisters are interacting on text? And most of the feedback was very good.
Well, you mentioned the rhythm of the text messages. How did you handle the challenge of pacing and chronology when switching between transcripts, messages, and traditional narrative chapters?
Yeah, that's another good question. I was about done with the book and I went through and I made a just a very simple outline that literally just had chapter numbers, because of course the text and transcript sections aren't chapters. And in fact, the entire first third of the book is all chapter 1, really. And then you get a chapter 2 at page, whatever, 105 or whatever, because the reader hopefully will realize it's not really a spoiler that the numbered chapters are Morgan and the unnumbered chapters, which just have a symbol, are Charlotte. And what I did to make sure that I had them broken up in a way that would be engaging and wouldn't wear the reader out was I just made a list of every section of the book, whether it was a chapter, a text conversation, transcript, or even a newspaper article, a press release, a diagram or something like that. And I looked at them visually and I did some rearranging of them to go, okay, well, I've had 3 kind of long prose chapters here. Can I move one of these text conversations up a little bit to just break that up so the pace is going along in a good way for the reader? And so that was, when it comes to outlining, I'm not really an outliner, but I will do that. I will take what I've written and create a shorthand for it and then try to move things around, shuffle things around a little bit to where I'm still telling the story in the chronology I want to tell it, but I'm also interspersing enough short stuff or little bite-sized stuff to keep things interesting and moving along.
Gotcha. Well, eventually in the interview transcripts, there appears the name of Dr. Heda Bentham, who is overseeing the medical well-being of Morgan as she's being interviewed, and has recommended more than once that the interview should halt and Morgan should be transferred to a hospital. So I have a tendency to read too much into things, as evidenced so far with the Nebraska State Hospital question. So this might be like way over the top. So the name Bentham carries some philosophical weight. Was there any ties to Jeremy Bentham?
So you're talking to a major high school debate dork. Okay. And in high school debate, we did a lot of philosophizing and using philosophers to help make our arguments. And Jeremy Bentham, the concept of utilitarianism. But outside of that, it was just a Victorian name. And I was thinking on my own. So Heda, I found on a list of Victorian names. I liked that. And then I kind of was like, Bentham, sounds about right. I knew that. I pulled that one out of the debate data bank of my mind. So that's the answer. There's no like philosophical link between the two individuals.
Gotcha. All right. So as I already mentioned, we kind of talked about electroshock therapy, modern day electroconvulsive therapy. There are several barbaric implements that are definitely no longer used that actually used to be used, I guess, in the late 1800s, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, most of the things that I pointed out in the book were from post-Civil War. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. And one is the Elizabeth collar, which other than a brief mention, I couldn't find any information on. It's almost like they were so ashamed of it, they scrubbed it from the internet. Like if you look it up, you'll see a bunch of pictures of dogs with the protective collars, like post-surgery and stuff like that. So can you tell us a little bit about this?
Sure. In writing the book, I did a pretty extensive deep dive. And what's interesting is I guess it's because of the, fascination with asylums that there are a lot of sort of hobbyists that have gone and archived information about different mental institutions over the last couple of 100 years, especially in the United States. And so you'll find these websites that truly look like they were built in like 1993, right? Mm-hmm. They've got that black background and just sort of words interspersed strangely and pictures dumped on there, and when you see that, you're dealing with a legit site,
somebody it's built entirely on HTML.
Yes. Yes. And I went through a long series of just looking at what people had found at these different institutions. And I do recall that, the Elizabeth collar didn't pop up a lot, but I found a couple of instances of it. And the Elizabeth collar is, imagine a sleeve on your Starbucks drink, and imagine that around your neck, and then sprouting out from the bottom of that, a large steel plate covered in leather. And then the collar laces around your neck. And so it is to prevent you from reaching your own head. So it's to block the arms. So the collar stretches out past the shoulders, and it's so that you can't pull out your hair or abuse yourself in that way. And so the Elizabeth collar makes an appearance in The Redemption of Morgan Bright with one of the characters. Yeah, that's a real one.
Yeah. And oddly enough, what I did easily find information on seems like it was way worse than the Elizabeth collar, which was the Utica crib.
Yeah, the Utica crib is a bad situation, man.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit?
Yeah.
A little bit about that. Let me bring it up here real quick.
Yeah, there's a lot of photos of that. So the Utica crib was taken from France. In other words, the idea was, I believe, from a French mental institution. And again, I wrote this 2 years ago, so I'm going off of memory. I think his name was Uriah Brigham, who was the director of the Utica State Mental Hospital in New York. He brought it to that institution, I think, in the 1880s, and employed it for the patients there. Now, Utica crib is, imagine a baby crib, but instead of it being, say, 3 feet deep, it's 1 foot deep or 1.5 feet deep, and it's got a lid on it. And they were allegedly used to calm people down and to just settle them down when they were having moments of hysteria.
I'm claustrophobic. I'd lose my shit.
Exactly. It had the reverse effect. And of course, it was also abused, where instead of being in there for a very short time, people were in there for days. And there's reports of people being in there for much, much longer. And there's also reports of some deaths. And it was so controversial, so bad, that at Utica, there were, I think, 3 doctors that were like, we can't do this. And they ended its use there. But there's no like registry of which institutions were using the Utica crib. So of course, Hollyhock has one, right? And so, yeah, so that was one of the most, barbaric things I found in my research. So of course I had to use it in my horror novel.
Absolutely. Well, Morgan's treatment began in the North Wing, while the South Wing was supposedly closed, although other patients in the asylum insisted that it wasn't. Morgan eventually discovers they were telling the truth when she's taken there and begins her slow progression towards being introduced to the calming room. So this is where I bait the readers. Readers at home, if you want to find out how the story ends, you'll have to read it for yourselves. But Chris, let me just say congratulations on an incredible piece of work.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thanks.
And to the listeners, buy it, read it, and review it. And so a little bit about the afterword. In it, you mentioned that Roe v. Wade was overturned as you were planning the story, which changed its entire trajectory. How did that moment reshape the narrative you originally intended to write?
I originally intended a story. I'd been mulling it over for a number of years. I originally intended to tell a story about someone who assumed a false identity to go into an asylum as a loose, very loose retelling of the story of Nellie Bly, who was a 23-year-old journalist in the 1890s who did have herself committed to a New York State mental institution to report on the conditions of the patients there. And they tried to keep her there. So I was thinking, okay, what if someone didn't get out, right? That's the horror story right there. They tried to keep her there. Her editor had to come and convince them that she wasn't actually insane and shouldn't be a patient there. And she wrote a book called 10 Days in a Madhouse, and it's publicly available. It's very interesting. I didn't read it until after I was done with Morgan Bright. I skimmed the first little bit just to get a flavor. And that's also where I got a lot of sort of the Victorian sensibility from that. But that's how I set out to start it. And then the summer before I really started writing it in earnest, Roe versus Wade was overturned. And I'm a pretty staunch believer in human rights and in women's rights to control their bodies. And that just set me off. And I knew I was telling a story about a women's institution, and I just couldn't write it without bringing the aspect of forced birth into it. And so forced birth definitely has a role in this story.
Well, was there a point where you kind of felt like reality was outpacing fiction? Like, I don't know what the timeline was as to when you started to when that happened and so on.
Dude, that happens all the time. Like it's so hard now. Truly. It's so hard to write horror now, especially if it's going to have any sort of social or political discourse. It's so hard to write something that people aren't like, yeah, look out the fucking window, man. This isn't scary. Look at the real world. So that's the new challenge for horror writers. And it's the new challenge, frankly, for writers of any type of fiction that is allegorical to our current world. I mean, I have a second world horror fantasy that I have written that is allegorical to our world. I've written science fiction that is allegorical to our world. And every day something happens that just like knocks one more thing off the list that I thought I had, that was purely fiction in my book. And now it's just reality. So that's always a challenge. And just going, boy, man, how much further in the future do I need to set this thing in? How crazy do I have to go to outpace our actual society? And it's getting really hard. I mean, just pick up the news. That's way scarier than anything I'm writing.
Well, so you feel like storytelling itself is becoming a form of resistance?
Oh, I mean, 1,000%.
Mm-hmm.
It's tough to write a story that isn't doing something politically or socially, right? And, of my 3 novels that are out, Phlebotomist certainly did that, and Morgan Bright certainly did that. I think that if you go big in terms of scope, you can't avoid it. You just cannot avoid, because if you're writing something that is big in scope, it rings as untrue and not believable to paint the world in a way that it just simply doesn't exist. And the reader feels like, no, this is not reality. Because what you like to do when you write is to start from a place of, hey, believe me, reader, believe what I'm telling you about the story. Here are some true things you recognize. Let's start here. And then I'm going to lead you down a path where I'm going to introduce things that are not true, but you're with me now. And it's tough to do that if you say, oh, here's a story that starts in our modern utopian society. I think you lose them right away as far as credibility for reality. So that's tough to do. That said, I do think there's a lot of story to be told and a lot of horror to be told in stories that are intimate in terms of a small group of people, a family, a haunted house story, right? You may not reach political or societal issues in a very insular story like that. And so, I have written one. I've got a book coming out in 2026 that is a haunted house story. And there are a few aspects of it that touch on society. There's the issue of a foster child in the story. And so you see a little bit of that, but it's because it's so insular and it's just a small group of people, it doesn't have the scope to make it a big pronouncement or an allegory for our society, politics, or society.
Well, could you maybe, as you mentioned the previous novels, give kind of a little brief synopsis, maybe whet the listener's appetite, maybe start with Stringers?
Yeah, sure. So Stringers was my second novel, and Stringers is like, if you just want a good time, Stringers is the book for you. I have learned so much about how to sell books and how to pitch books because of Stringers, because A lot happens in Stringers. Stringers is a friendship story. It's a story about the nature of the universe and consciousness itself. However, I pitch it as two stoners get abducted. And that is how I should have been pitching it from the beginning. Because that's really what it is. Two stoners get abducted. It's way deeper than that. A lot happens. There's a lot of kind of hard science in it that's very interesting and a lot of fun, and a lot of adventure and a lot of found family stuff, the stuff that people read like Becky Chambers for. And it's also a very humorous take on space adventure. So it's two stoners get abducted. So if you have stoners in your life, this might be a book for them. So that's Stringers. That one is just a ton of fun. And my debut was The Phlebotomist. And The Phlebotomist is a story about a near future society. It's a dystopia where society is segregated by blood type. And the main character is Willa Wallace. She is a grandmother who has sole care of her grandson. And she is what is known as a reaper. She collects blood for the harvest, which is the mandatory blood draw that the government forces everybody to do. And she starts to uncover some truths about the work she is doing and goes from there. Things go not good from there.
Well, are you continuously writing or only when the inspiration strikes?
You know, I always thought this was kind of cliche when I would hear people say, before I was really writing, when people would say, you know, inspiration, ideas are cheap. That has turned out to be the truth. I get a bazillion million ideas because once you're focused on this, I think it's like any other trade. When you're really focused on something and you're thinking about it all the time, your brain is running in the background. And so I'm always coming up with ideas and I write as much as I can. I tend to be a pretty quick writer, although, boy, I'll tell you, some of my friends in the horror community put me to shame. I mean, putting out 3 and 4 books a year, it's just, that is unfathomable to me. I mean, bravo. I think I write fast, but not compared to some. And so really it's about the flavor of your story. You may have an idea for a vampire story. You may have an idea for a werewolf story, but then you look at The Buffalo Hunter by Stephen Graham Jones. That's a vampire story, but you're not going to read another story like that. You look at When the Wolf Comes Home by Nat Cassidy. That's a werewolf story. You're not going to read another werewolf story like that. So the ideas are cheap. Sometimes there's a really catchy idea that writes the story for you, and that's great. And you see those happen, but really it's about the execution and it's about the characters and who they are that really get readers invested. I think an idea can carry you into the story, but characters have to carry you through it.
Yeah, I was trying to remember it, so I had to look it up. I was curious to know, as far as like, when it comes to an idea, what determines whether you think it will make it. There's a quote. I don't know if Stephen King just said it in some sort of a conversation or if it was in his on writing book, but a writer's notebook is the best way to immortalize bad ideas.
Well, you know, that's a fantastic point, but now I'm trying to remember who said this because I've heard it said so many times. It might have been a writer, it might have been a TV showrunner who said that it's not the first idea or the second or the third that will be the idea for the story. It's the fourth, fifth, or sixth. And I found that to be true for almost every book I've written, barring maybe one, and short stories. I will go in with an idea and I will realize that that idea isn't quite enough to propel the story, and that the better idea is like a cousin to the initial idea. But I had to write the first idea to get to the second idea, which brought me to the third and the fourth idea. So I truly believe what Stephen King is saying. You know, you write down that first idea, you go try to execute it, and you realize actually the second or third idea is the better idea.
Yeah. Well, so which part of the process do you enjoy more, getting the raw draft down or shaping and refining during revisions?
I know authors who hate revising. I utterly love it. I really do. And I love being edited. I love it.
Can you kill your darlings?
Yeah, totally. And I really kind of revel in it when I'm able to do it. Morgan Bright there was a big set piece in Morgan Bright that I deleted. And it was one of these things, and this happens to me a decent amount, where I've written something, really like it, and in the back of my head, I'm like, I don't know that this really fits, but it's a fun scene and a lot of cool stuff happens. And it will be the subconscious voice going, it doesn't really fit, Chris. And a great example is there was a big scene in The Redemption of Morgan Bright I had written, and both my wife had said, I don't know that this fits. And my editor, when she sent back my structural edit, she had highlighted the whole thing and it just had one word as a comment, and it was bro. And I knew I knew what that meant. And it was so easy. And it was all I needed to push me over the edge. It was so easy. I just deleted, I highlighted it, deleted, it was gone. And so I like it when someone else points out something to me that maybe I've been playing with the idea of, is this right? But my ego was going to make me keep it in. And so I like to be kind of pushed off the cliff and go, you're right. I needed to be pushed off the cliff here. So I do love being edited. But as far as drafting versus editing, I get different satisfaction out of them. So with drafting, I love it. It's complete freedom. I love just being able to create. I love brainstorming and making connections that I didn't know that were there. And it's so much fun. And then I love revising because I have to write the whole book before I know truly what it's about and before I truly know who the characters are. So it's when I go back in that first revision, what you would call the second draft, that I really shape the story to make it work. And then subsequent drafts just hone it more. But I really love when I finish the excitement of going, okay, I'm going to put this away for a few weeks. Sometimes I struggle to do that, but I need to get some distance from it. And then I just love going back in and going, okay, I know what the story is. I know who these people are now. So everything that they do needs to reflect that from the start of the story. So I love them both equally. Revising is a little more tedious, but the initial drafting is just going to the carnival. It's super fun.
Gotcha. Well, in addition to being a writer, you're also an accomplished artist. You've created album covers for metal bands and even produced a coloring book. So can you tell us a bit about that side of your creative work?
Yeah, I mean, I've been into art for a long time, but only in my early 30s did I really decide to try to get good at art, where I was always drawing, but never really focusing on it and trying to hone the craft. And so I did that for a number of years and got to a point that I was getting hired by bands to do their albums and publishers to do their book covers. Yeah, you see a bunch of them there.
These are illustration. Is that like for books or is...
Yeah, so the one you've got highlighted, that the one with the four women, that one was for an Angry Robot book. The one above that is that one I did for a book for Angry Robot that was called The Cleaving, and it's a retelling of, it's an Arthurian tale. And then the top three, I think, the three at the top are all books. One is for Gemma Amore's book, one is for V. Castro's book, and the other one is for...
I see The Chosen Path, Peligroso, and Beam.
Paul Michael Anderson, yeah. And then the rest, most of those are T-shirts and album covers and, some posters. I really got into that in the early in the teens. And then what you're looking at there is my figurative oil paint. So I do a lot of oil painting too. I don't do as much oil painting anymore, but I was really into it. I did shows at galleries and all that stuff, and I fucking hate galleries.
Is this one of them?
Yeah. So that was a commission where I painted for scale. I think those are 9 feet tall.
Wow.
Those are 9 by 5 feet, I think 9 by 4 maybe. Mm-hmm. And they were for a guy's big condo or something like that. And it was fun to paint those. I love painting those abstracts. But eventually I decided I want to write books, just kind of out of the blue in 2015. And I really sucked shit at it. I was really bad. And I just wrote every day. And that's the thing about both art and writing is I certainly believe in talent. I think there are people who are talented, but I think far more artists and far more writers are just skilled and they learned those skills. 99% of them just honed a craft and just worked at it and got good.
Well, would you like to read a passage from the book?
Sure, I can read. It's not even a full page, but there's a recurring vision that Morgan has while she is at Hollyhock.
Okay.
And I'll read you just a passage. This is from chapter 23. There's no spoilers or anything like that, but this is part of the vision she has. And it's sort of it could be hallucination. She might be actually seeing it, so it's a little bit dreamy. So stick with me. Growing longer and thinner, the woman is a wave of fabric, a ribbon beating on the wind. I have seen her face and do not recognize her, and yet I know her. I have seen her in the face of every woman, feet still planted in the hoarfrost. She is pulled and drawn long by her station. Slow at first, but then more rapidly the farther out she goes. Soon her head and shoulders are distant, too high in the sky for me to discern. Even in the midst of whatever this is, a fever dream, a hallucination, I worry for her as she climbs towards the clouds, and I know this is no ascension, no rise to a better place, no actualization of self. I see along the length of her a life, birth, a childhood, time of learning and wonder, of limitless horizons. But the passage of time is a thief. The obligations set upon her by the circumstance of her birth foreclose opportunity as others graft their horizons upon her, buttressing themselves in her strength and steadfastness, stressing her ligaments, the sinews which hold her body together and her mind connected. She is the strength of womanhood under duress, pulled by the world to its purposes. She is an unbroken circle, comforting, giving warmth, protecting, securing futures that aren't hers. But she forgets those dreams of childhood, aspirations both fanciful and practical, as the space in her mind is crowded out by the dreams of others, and at long last, she forgets herself. It seems that she might stretch forever, but the limit is reached. Her feet leave the ground, and like the tail of a kite broken free, she flies away. So that's
very
that.
nice.
Thanks.
Here, I'll even
That's the biggest crowd I've ever read in front of, I'll tell you that.
Well, so in addition to being an artist working in various media, you're also a lawyer renowned for winning civil lawsuits on behalf of families who have lost loved ones to mesothelioma caused by asbestos exposure from talcum powder. So do you feel that any aspect of your legal work, such as research, contributes to your writing? And can you just speak a little bit about your law practice in general?
Sure. For over 20 years, I've tried cases all over the country representing people who are sick or have cancer from environmental toxins. So that includes a lot of those cases are asbestos. We've done groundwater poisoning cases. We've done pharmaceuticals, other stuff. But for the most part, I stand up in front of a jury and tell them the story about why the manufacturer in the case, cut corners, knew about the hazards of their products and failed to warn about them or failed to recall them or pull them from the market. And the last big, effort that we had was in going after Johnson & Johnson for asbestos in the talcum powder. Briefly, talc is a rock. So a lot of people don't even understand that when they're sprinkling talc on themselves or their baby, they're just sprinkling crushed rock. Okay. That's what talc is. And talc, because it's a rock that comes out of the ground, doesn't grow homogenously. There's all sorts of other stuff in there, and talc and asbestos are very closely related geologically. So if you mine talc, you are also mining asbestos almost without exception. And so I tried a lot of those cases and tried to do good for these families that were struck by tragedy. I got into writing in 2015. I was going to do that whether I was practicing law or not. And certainly, having been a lawyer and seen the inside workings of corporation after corporation after corporation, I became pretty jaded. And what I mean by that is, if a corporation does something bad, there's a near 100% chance they knew about it and that they just decided to keep doing it. I won't get into the whole thing, but it has definitely informed my worldview. And so I am very suspicious of corporations when they say, oh, we're going to do X, Y, or Z, and this is good for you, the consumer. Take that with a grain of salt the size of Cadillac. And then I also understand how companies work, and I understand how the legal system works. So if I do, use a little bit of the legal system in a book, generally that has been helpful that I've been a lawyer, but I don't want to write law books. I don't want to write legal thrillers. People ask me all the time, you're going to write law stuff. And I'm like, I want to do that less than I want to get dunked upside down in a boiling vat of oil, truly. So it's definitely helped, and it informs who I am and it informs my worldview, but I'm going to stick to, writing about ghosts and monsters.
Well, so I'm assuming you've either seen the movie or read the book Fight Club.
Yeah, of course.
So is it true with stuff like asbestos and stuff like that? They basically do that math equation where, like, well, if we have to settle a class action lawsuit, it'll be this much, which will be much cheaper than the profits we make. So just go ahead and do it.
100%. We've introduced those documents to the jury where they have seen the actual math that the company does. Yeah, 100%. That is not fiction. That is real life where they do the calculus on human lives. Yes. Ugh. Yep. Like I said, look out the window, and there's way more real horror in the real world than there is on the pages of my book.
Yeah. Well, hopefully what I'm about to ask has a brighter answer.
I'm sure. I'll make sure it does.
What is the life of Chris Panatier like outside of writing, painting, and practicing law?
I'm a really, really lucky person. I live a pretty happy and fortunate life. I have a family. I have a little girl who I love dearly. That in taking a step back from the practice of law, I get to be a dad. I get to be here. I take her to school every day. She writes, she does art. So I do all of that with her. So she's kind of everything. I also, again, I think I have weaponized my ADHD. I say I'm undiagnosed, but I have friends who are, and they say for sure. But anyway, I also practice Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which is really just a martial art where you just are always bad, and then you just get slightly less bad after many years. But it's so much fun. I love it. And I have a wildflower garden, and I bird watch. I turned into an old man bird watcher over the pandemic. I've got feeders right out here that I watch through my monocular. How old am I? Am I 80? So I get into a lot of different stuff. If I take an interest in something, I tend to dive into it. My friend Gemma Amor, who is also a horror author and has been sort of my guide in this community, she said that she heard ADHD characterized as not a deficit in attention, but in a surplus of focus. And that, when I heard her say that, I was like, yes, that is what I have. I have too much I can focus on. So I'm constantly jumping from one thing to the next. Luckily, whatever breed of it I have, I tend to finish things, but I might hop around to 20 things and they might finish in some random order, but they'll get done.
I got to remember that. Not a lack of focus, but a what?
Not a deficit of attention, but a surplus of focus.
Not a deficit of attention, but a surplus. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. In other words, it's not that you can't pay attention to things. It's that you have so much you want to focus on that you tend to jump around to those things. And when I heard that, I was like, that's me, unofficially.
Yeah. Well, Chris, it has been a pleasure talking with you.
Well, thank you for having me on. I was really thrilled to meet you at Ghoulish. That was awesome. And I love that you got the book and had me on and gave me a chance to talk about it. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Absolute pleasure to read and have you on the show. Well, so as we bring the show to a close, is there anything you'd like to plug or let your readers know about?
There will be some stuff on socials coming soon and various different projects that are going to be public very soon. So if you happen to be paying attention to anything, just keep your eye out. I'm a total attention whore, so I'm everywhere. I'm easy to find on socials. I have a website. I'm not hard to find. So you can find me, and I love chatting with readers. So if you're a reader, just hit me up anytime.
Well, listeners at home, you will not have to worry about being able to find him because all links will be and are in the description. And Chris, thank you again for joining me.
Hey, thanks, Vincent. I appreciate it.
And thank you to everyone who tuned in. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Be sure to tune in next Tuesday for a new episode featuring the best and brightest authors and filmmakers of dark literature and film. So until then, stay healthy, stay sane, and as always, thank you for listening. See you next time.